Well, hello and welcome everyone to the mid-season finale of the Maple Leaf Route webinar series. As always, I am your host, Eric Story. I'm the Outreach Manager of the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada and a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario. Now, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the extensive history of the land in which the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada resides. Our office is located on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples. It is encompassed by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty made between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples at the Great Peace of Montreal in 1701, and the Haldimand Proclamation, signed between the Haudenosaunee and the British Crown in 1784, following the American Revolution, which promised to the Haudenosaunee lands that extend 6 miles on either side of the Grand River from its source near Orangeville to Lake Erie. Today, this treaty territory remains the homeland of Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee communities, as well as the home of many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. Acknowledging the history of these two nations' presence and relationship to the land since time immemorial and through 300 years of treaty making is a reminder that they remain the original stewards of the lands and waters upon which the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada resides. Over the past 2 months, we have been exploring Canada's contributions to the Second World War. We began with the war at sea with Jeff Noakes, and 3 weeks ago, we then turned to the battlefields of Western Europe with Anna Pearson, Steve Connors, and Robert Katzberg of Nipissing University, who detailed the overlooked liberation of the small Dutch town of Welburg in 1944, and then discussed what battlefield tours can offer the students that attend them. Tonight, however, we turn our eyes or turn our attention to the air and the role of the Royal Canadian Air Force. But before I turn it over to our speaker this evening, I just have a brief message from our sponsors. The Juno Beach Centre is in the last few days of fundraising as part of this month's Great Canadian Giving Challenge, supported by Canada Helps. Consider donating tonight to help support the Juno Beach Centre and its mission of honoring the legacy of our veterans. For every dollar donated, the Juno Beach Centre will receive one ballot to win an additional $20,000 to support the many programs and online exhibits that it continues to offer free of charge. One such program is the Centre's new podcast, Witnesses to History. You may have seen in the PowerPoint what it's going to show, but it's going to air its 4th episode tomorrow, and it will focus on Canadian fighter ace George Burling. As thanks for your ongoing support and for attending tonight's webinar, the Juno Beach Centre is offering a 10% discount for any RCAF related item in its online store. Use the code RCAF10 from now until June 2nd for 10% off. You can also donate to our partner, the Canadian Battlefields Foundation, by visiting their website, cbf-fccb.ca/donate. Don't worry, you don't need to remember any of these links. I'll be sure to share them with you when I turn things over to our speaker. But the Canadian Battlefields Foundation, like many cultural and educational institutions over the course of the pandemic, need your help to continue offering its battlefield tours to Canadian students and spreading awareness of the important role of Canada during the World Wars. Again, please visit cbf-fccb.ca/donate to support this important cause. Now, your speaker for tonight is actually tuning in from Kitchener, Ontario, or Kitchener-Waterloo, I should say, close to where I am at the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada. Many of you will know him, and a fewer number, but I'm sure still many will know him quite well. His name is Mike Bechtold. He holds a PhD from the University of New South Wales and is a historian of the Royal Canadian Air Force. He is the author or editor of 8 books and numerous articles, and specializes in the fields of military air power in the World Wars, the Canadian Army in Normandy and Northwest Europe, and the Canadian Corps during the Great War. His most recent monograph, Flying to Victory, Raymond Collishaw and the Western Desert Campaign, was published in 2017 with the Oklahoma University Press and is available for tonight for 20% off through the Oklahoma University Press's website. Just enter the discount code 18ACE22 at checkout to receive 20% off. And don't worry, you don't need to remember these things. I will make sure to share them with you. You can also find Flying to Victory at Indigo and Amazon for cheaper than what we have available through the Oklahoma University Press. But we do hope that you will purchase from the press, as it's very much appreciated by them. Now, just two brief reminders for the audience before I turn things over to Mike. First, if you find the closed captioning that's kind of running across the bottom of your screen at all distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the CC button located at the bottom of the Zoom window. And second, if a question comes to you, I know I say this every time, I sound like a broken record, but if a question does come to you at any point during the presentation tonight, just enter it into the Q&A right away. You're not going to distract Mike at all. And when you do ask that question or enter it into the Q&A, make sure to let us know where you're coming from, because it's a ton of fun to know where people are tuning in from across Canada, across North America, and even across the world. Without any further delay, Mike Bechtold in his presentation tonight entitled Per Ardua ad Astra, the Royal Canadian Air Force and the Second World War.
Great. Thanks very much, Eric, for that very kind introduction. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you, Eric, for the invitation, and Kevin and Jeff Hayes, who first reached out to me. And I'm really happy to be here to talk to you about the Air Force today. I've had a look at the list of participants, and it's almost an old home week. There's a lot of familiar names there, people I've talked to recently, and some that I haven't seen in far too long. So it's great to connect with you today, even if it is virtually. Hopefully at some point we'll be able to get together in the same room again, but we're not quite there yet. So for the next 40 minutes, 45 minutes, something like that, I want to talk to you about the Royal Canadian Air Force in the Second World War. It's a big, rich, complex topic, something that I'm sure all of you know something about. Some of you know a lot about it, maybe even more than I do. But what I want to do today is kind of pick and choose and look at a few topics. I'm sure most of you are familiar of the Great War aces, Billy Bishop, Raymond Collishaw, those famous flyers. And there's lots of names from the Second World War that you know, Andy Minarski and Buzz Burling, Hammy Gray, Len Burchell, the Victoria Cross recipients, and the great stories of what they did and what they accomplished during the war. And those stories are great. Those stories have a lot of drama. They're really important to our history and our understanding of the Air Force. But I want to try to tap into some stories that maybe you don't know as much about today. Let me get my slides going for you so you don't have to stare at my ugly mutt for the next little bit. And then we will get going. So there and there. All right, you should have that up on your screen now. So per ardua ad astra, through adversity to the stars. And that's a great motto for the Air Force. The Air Force, like most of the Canadian military, like all of the Canadian military, grew exponentially during the course of the Second World War. The Canadian Air Force really only dates back to, well, officially 1924, when the Royal Canadian Air Force was formed. There were antecedents before that, but really the nature of the service was very young. In 1939, the RCAF was very small. You can see the details up there on your screen right now. 8 squadrons, regular squadrons, 12 auxiliary squadrons, and only 4,000 personnel, all ranks. I'll say personnel, but it was really all men at that point. It was the nature of the beast at that time. So a very small formation. But in a few short years, the service expanded. 80 operational squadrons, 48 that were sent overseas on active service, another 32 that were flying active missions here in Canada and North America, and over 232,000 men and 17,000 women had joined the ranks of the Air Force, which is a really impressive accomplishment. And what did the Air Force do during that period? Well, they did all sorts of things, and I'm sure you know some of these stories, but not all of them. The British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, Canadian Squadron took part in the Battle of Britain. Dieppe is one of the topics we're going to talk about today. The Battle of the Atlantic and the important role of of the RCAF and RCF pilots that were flying out over the Atlantic looking for U-boats. As Mark Miller will tell you, it wasn't about what they destroyed, but the fact that they were there, the fact that they kept the U-boats down, that they chased them away from the convoys. And it was an absolutely essential role that they performed. There were RCAF squadrons in the Far East, transport squadrons, and additional Canadian personnel. In the Middle East, I'm not going to talk about Raymond Collishaw today. He wasn't actually RCAF, but he was a Canadian serving in the Royal Air Force. But there were Canadian squadrons flying in North Africa early on, in Malta, in Italy, and throughout that region. The story of CANRAF personnel is a huge topic that needs a lot more exploration. These are Canadians like Collishaw who served in the Royal Air Force. And they've kind of been lost to us as Canadians. Yes, they were Canadians, but they weren't in the RCAF. They weren't tallied as numbers, and we don't really know how many of them there were. We can make some educated guesses, but there was a lot of them, and they made a big impact. Bomber Command is another topic we're going to talk about today. And then, of course, 2nd Tactical Air Force in Normandy, which is a huge topic, and a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. I'm working on an edited collection right now, looking at tactical air power in the Normandy campaign. I put together a really all-star slate of authors that are going to be writing chapters, have written chapters for me, and people like Alex Black, who I see is here today, Seb Cox, Heather Venable, Russell Hart, Paul Johnston have all written some really great topics that explore an issue that is known but isn't known like it needs to be. So we're working on sort of taking the tarp off that topic. So these are the 3 topics that I've chosen to zero in on today. The British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. We're going to look at the air battle of Dieppe, and we're going to look at Bomber Command and some of the ideas and issues around that and what its role is. I know the idea of a strategic bombing campaign, the bombing of cities, the wide scale death and destruction of cities, of civilians, is one that doesn't ring true to our 21st century sensibilities. And we have to be careful on how we evaluate that. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And I think without any further ado, we'll dig into it. The British Commonwealth Air Training Plan is perhaps Canada's greatest contribution to the Second World War, the Allied war effort in the Second World War. And I know that's a very big claim, but this was a huge program. It was expensive and it was extensive. And I just want to take you through a little bit about that to make sure that we're all on the same page of how important this was. Now, the training of pilots and aircrew was a really complicated task. It's one that took a lot of technical know-how. It's one that took a lot of infrastructure, runways, buildings, staff, ground crew, mechanics, administrators. And it was a task that wasn't ideally suited to be taking place in the United Kingdom. It was too small, too congested, too close to the enemy. And so what better place to do it than in the wide open spaces of Canada, where you've got all sorts of area to build runways, to have areas for flying practice, a place where the enemy can't get at you. So the British were in early conversations with the Canadian government about doing this. And it was something that our Prime Minister at the time, William Lyon Mackenzie King, grasped onto as a really good way to focus Canadian contributions to the Second World War. King wasn't a pacifist by any means. He certainly understood the importance of the war, the importance of Canada participating, but he also had an eye to the past, looking at what had happened in the First World War, the slaughter, the bloodbath, the high personnel losses that everybody, and Canada in particular, suffered on the Western Front. And he wanted to avoid that. He wanted to avoid that catastrophe of the trenches. So he looked at the BCATP as a way of making a significant Canadian contribution while maybe not putting as many Canadian boys into the firing line as might otherwise be the case. So the plan was settled early on, and it grew beyond what anybody had expected. But it was about training ground crew and air crew. It was about using facilities, taking advantage of the resources that were here in Canada. And it really was a cross Canada endeavor. That map that's on your screen now really shows you that it went from coast to coast. I can't say coast to coast to coast at this point, but we're going everywhere from Comox and Patricia's Bay in on Vancouver Island all the way across to Greenwood and Debert and other places like that in Nova Scotia. The prairies was a big area for it for obvious reasons. It was wide open. There was lots of space. It was easy to find land to build airfields or take advantage of airfields that were already there. And central Canada was also a big spot. This area around where I am in southwestern Ontario had a lot of stations, a lot of airfields built, a lot of training establishments that were built to take care of this. And it was a huge endeavor that took a lot of effort. At its peak, there were some 107 schools across the country, 184 ancillary units at a total of 231 sites, just absolutely enormous. And to be able to staff and manage that system were over 100,000, 104,000 men and women that were administering a fleet of over 10,000 aircraft. Which is absolutely enormous. I mean, recall those numbers I gave you back in 1939 with the RCAF, with 8 squadrons and 4,000 personnel. And all of a sudden, this is what we've got devoted just to the training establishment in Canada. It was an absolutely remarkable achievement. And I know I've already said it, it was one of Canada's greatest contributions, but just look at the numbers of personnel that went through the training program. 131,553 air crew that were trained. That depends what source you look at, but that's approximately half the fighting strength of the RAF, RCAF, RAAF, and the other allied air forces overseas, and another 80,000 air crew were trained for that. And of course, to do that big of a job, to have that important a task, it cost money. Overall, the program cost about $2.2 billion in the currency of the day, and Canada paid about $1.6 billion of that. And I know the currency calculators are problematic in terms of saying what money was worth then versus now, but in looking at that currency converter, it equates to about $27 billion today, which is not insignificant. Not only were sort of Commonwealth pilots, aircrew being trained, Canadian, British, New Zealand, Australian, etc., but there was also graduates coming from Nazi-occupied Europe. There were some 2,000 French pilots and aircrew that were trained, Czech pilots. Norway, Little Norway is still known up in Northern Ontario near, I guess it's Bracebridge, where they had their main training base. Polish pilots, Belgian, Dutch came through. And of course, piloting training is dangerous, but we hear stories of how many pilots were killed during training in the First World War. Some accounts say as many as half of all pilots were killed in training. I think those numbers are really overblown and have been discounted, but it was a dangerous profession. But there were about 856 men that were killed during the course of training here in Canada. And of course, many of those can be found in cemeteries. Commonwealth War Grave Commission tended grave sites across the country today. So an absolutely enormous contribution. Mackenzie King wanted this. He advocated for it. He found the money to make it work. He thought this was going to lower our contribution to the war effort in terms of the Butcher's Bill. But as we'll see later on, it really did the exact opposite and put many thousands of Canadians, tens of thousands of Canadians, into one of the most dangerous professions there were during the course of the war. So that's just a quick ramble over the BCATP. I think it's a topic that needs more discussion, more awareness. There's been a number of really good books that have been written about it, but it's not a topic that's been anywhere close to exhausted yet. The next topic that I want to sort of focus on for a little bit is Dieppe. And I think Dieppe is a really interesting topic from a Canadian point of view. It's certainly one that I've talked about extensively over the years, mostly from sort of an amphibious warfare aspect, the role of 2nd Canadian Division in landing in Dieppe, Operation Jubilee on the 19th of August, 1942, a controversial operation for sure. I don't need to tell you how costly it was. Over 900 Canadians were killed that day landing on the beach. It was a complete failure from the point of view of sort of most of its objectives. But a lot of the focus that is given to Dieppe is towards the amphibious operation. David O'Keefe, I'm not sure if he's here tonight, has done a fabulous job opening up a new area for investigation about the Pinch operation and the role of Enigma in the operation. But the air component is another one that's really deserves more attention. Norman Franks has written an excellent book. I'm not sure if you can see that on your screen on the Dieppe air battle. He calls it the greatest air battle, and does a really good job bringing out the stories, the accounts, the air-to-air combat, the sacrifice in the air that took place. But I want to talk to you about it from how the operation plays into the bigger role of what was happening to the RAF and the RCAF at that point in the war. And you can see on my screen, I call it the super circus. That's a term that I pulled out of the official history, the Canadian official history of the RCAF. And that term needs a little bit of description and a little bit of a background. So RAF Fighter Command was built to defend the British Isles. They brought in the Hurricane and the Spitfire, which were really excellent single-seat fighters, well-armed, good speed for their day, but short-ranged. And they were designed to protect the British Isles. And they did a fantastic job of that during the Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain was Germany's attempt to destroy the RAF, to clear the skies so they could have the invasion of the UK take place. As we all know, that didn't happen. The RAF was triumphant. They took heavy losses doing it, but the Luftwaffe took even heavier losses. And with the ability of the RAF to remain a force in being, there was no way Germany could consider an invasion. So that idea died. The end of the Battle of Britain, however, created a bit of a conundrum for the RAF. Here we have this huge fighter force, dozens of squadrons, with really no apparent role anymore. They've done their job. They've defended the United Kingdom. They've stopped the Luftwaffe. But what do we do with this resource now? Do we ship them off to other fighting fronts, the Far East, the Middle East? Well, they could do that with some squadrons, but they don't want to take the risk that the Germans could renew their assault. So they have to keep that force in being. But the fighter pilots were edgy. They wanted to do something. The commanders didn't want them just sitting there. So they started to have operations over the continent. And they had a wide number of code names for these, rhubarbs and rodeos and circuses. And the idea that was underpinning most of them was that they wanted to bring the Luftwaffe to battle. They wanted to keep dogfighting. They wanted to destroy the Luftwaffe in the air in battle. So they were sending RAF squadrons over the continent. But all those advantages the RAF had during the Battle of Britain, fighting over their home territory, short ranges for intercepts, the fact that if they got shot down, they would and survive the shoot down, they would parachute and be back at their air base that same day, and maybe even up in another plane and right back into the battle. While the Luftwaffe had a lot of things going against it, the range, the distance, flying across the English Channel, they only had a limited amount of time to engage in combat before they had to break off and head back home or risk running out of fuel. And also, if they were shot down, well, their war was over. They became prisoners of war, and that was that. Well, you reverse the story. You send the the RAF and the RCAF over occupied Europe, and now the RAF has all those same problems: distance, lack of loiter time, loss of pilots and aircrew when aircraft are shot down. And early on, the Luftwaffe figured out that it was kind of a mutz game for them, that they didn't really need to go up and fight the RAF, that there was no real gain for them. The RAF attacks weren't really doing any damage. They couldn't do any damage. Fighter sweeps on their own were just excursions that couldn't cause any destruction or damage to the German Empire. Bombing raids were mostly pretty small scale affairs at that point in the war that weren't causing much damage. So the RAF was kind of scratching its head at how do we get to do what we want to do? How do we pull the Luftwaffe up to come and fight us and actually do what we want? And so the idea behind these various operations, the circus in particular, was really to use a bomber force as a carrot, as a way to tease the Luftwaffe up to defend its airspace. And a small number of bombers would then be defended by a large number of fighters, which was the real purpose of the raid, to draw the Luftwaffe up and into aerial combat. So the RAF was, I won't quite say fighting a separate war than the army at this point, but it was pretty close to that. Dieppe for them was not about the raid. It was not about any of the objectives of the Dieppe operation, whether it be collecting intelligence, getting an Enigma machine, testing amphibious doctrine, the whole long laundry list of the reasons the raid took place. For them, they saw it as a super circus. It was going to be a big air battle with the enormous carrot that the Luftwaffe couldn't help but fall for. That instead of using bombers as the enticement, they had this entire invasion force, all of 2nd Canadian Division and the 2 commandos that were the reason that would draw the Luftwaffe up to play. And it absolutely worked. It 100% worked. This became the largest single one-day air battle of the entire war. Just to give you an example, I think I've got the numbers later on, but RAF and RCAF squadrons flew nearly 3,000 sorties that day. And a sortie is one flight by one aircraft. Some aircraft flew multiple missions during the day, but there were nearly 3,000 sorties flown by Allied aircraft. That's almost 3 times the rate of the busiest day for the RAF during the Battle of Britain. So an absolutely enormous contribution of forces to do this. And as far as the RAF was concerned, as far as the RCAF was concerned, it was an enormously successful mission, but we'll come back to that. So there were some 72 Canadian and British squadrons that took part, and I've got the full breakdown for anybody that's interested in seeing those details. 48 Spitfire squadrons, 8 Hurricane squadrons. 2 of those were Hurra bombers that were employed in a fighter bomber role, and 6 of them were 20 millimeter cannon armed Hurricanes. All 8 of those squadrons were doing Army support missions. There were 6 Boston squadrons. In fact, I think that's a picture of a Boston over Dieppe. I should have pointed out before that this is a Boston that's been photographed over Dieppe. If you look in the top left corner, you can see just make out the smoke coming from a building just behind the main beach in Dieppe. You can make out the, I think I've got a pointer. You can see there's the smoke coming up there, and right there are the harbor moles of Dieppe. So an interesting image from the raid. But there was 5 RAF Bomber Command Boston squadrons and one that was not Bomber Command. I'm not sure who it was attached to, that were tasked to do 2 missions. One lay smoke, which was very effective, and the other was to bomb gun batteries and other targets like that, which were less successful. There were 4 Mustang squadrons that were all doing fighter recce missions. 3 Typhoon squadrons. I think this was the first, I'm not sure if Matt Bone is here, he'll correct me if I'm wrong, but 3 Typhoon squadrons, and this might have been their first major sortie. They were kept a little bit farther away from the action because of a couple of reasons. One, they closely resembled the German Focke-Wulf 190, which is a problem, and actually led to one of the Typhoons being shot down by a Spitfire. But they were also having some teething problems at this point. They had a nasty tendency to shed their tail and some other issues that hadn't quite been ironed out yet. And this was also one of the first major missions by the U.S. Army Air Forces over continental Europe, and we'll get to that more in a second. So for the RCAF, it was a major contribution. There were 6 Spitfire squadrons, 2 Mustangs, and I think it was a Boston squadron. Yes, a Boston squadron as well that made a major contribution. So they were nominally tasked with the fighters with protecting the beachhead, protecting the fleet, and they were more or less successful. The Luftwaffe had a bit of a free rein at times when there was a lag in fighter cover. There was one Royal Navy destroyer that was sunk when it was hit by a bomb from a Focke-Wulf 190 fighter bomber, but that was as the invasion fleet was withdrawing at the end of the day. But for the most part, they kept the Luftwaffe from having any serious impact on either the fleet or on the invasion forces on the beach, or sort of leaving or arriving at the beach. So from that perspective, it was successful. U.S. Air Force, Army Air Force B-17s had just started arriving in England, and they were just sort of starting to test out how well this new weapon was going to work over occupied Europe. We'll talk a little bit more about it later, but the Americans had a very different concept of strategic bombing than the RAF Bomber Command, whereas our RAF Bomber Command had discovered early on in the war that their bombers couldn't survive in the daylight over occupied Europe. The Americans were bound to determine that they were going to fight their way to and from the target using their flying fortresses, which were much more heavily armed than the equivalent British heavy bombers. And they thought that using their formations, the vast firepower, that they'd be able to do what the British weren't able to do. But at this point in the war, they were just testing that out. And they'd had, I think their first mission over France was a couple days earlier, and they were tasked, they had 4 B-17 squadrons from the 97th Bomb Group that were tasked to support the Dieppe operation. The bombers themselves weren't risked over Dieppe. Early on in the planning for the operation, Churchill had nixed the idea of the use of heavy bombers in direct support of the army. He saw the downside of casualties amongst French civilians as too high, and wouldn't authorize that. So RAF Bomber Command, for the most part, wasn't involved in the operation. But the B-17s were tasked to attack a German airfield at Abbeville as a distraction, as a way of hoping to keep down the Luftwaffe in the Mediterranean. The RAF used the term fumigation raids for this kind of a strike. Fumigation sort of being a play on the idea of keeping the bugs down, keeping the Luftwaffe down. This wasn't called a fumigation raid, but it was that same idea. And they had 2 squadrons of American fighters that were tasked to support, but also 4 squadrons of British aircraft, well, 2 British and 2 Canadian. And the 4 squadrons supporting it were the best, most modern mark of the Spitfire, the Mark 9, that had just come into service. It was proving to be the equivalent or better of the Focke-Wulf 190. And the reason the British tasked these squadrons to support the B-17s was that they didn't want anything to happen to the Americans at this point. They were just getting ramped up. They were just starting, and they didn't want any kind of disaster to strike them that might make them change their mind and maybe not commit to participating in the bomber raid. The Americans were able to get the raid done with no problem. Everybody made it back without any losses. The Americans, I'm not going to say they were very full of themselves. They were very confident of their abilities at this point. I don't think it was this raid, but it was another American raid around this time period that they'd sent their crews over occupied Europe, and they'd been attacked by the Luftwaffe. And when they got back, they'd found that the gunners and the bombers had claimed 102 kills and probable kills in one short mission. RAF intelligence looked at those numbers and decided that, yeah, those are probably a little inflated. We'll give you credit for about 60. And after the war, they went into the German records, and they discovered that 1 German Luftwaffe aircraft had been lost that day's action. So the idea of kills and claims is something we're going to come back to, in fact, on the next slide. So the balance sheet. This is a really interesting slide from my perspective. You can see the number of fighters on both sides. The RAF and RCAF had 730 fighters and 100 bombers. The Luftwaffe had a much smaller number available, 120 fighters and 100 bombers. And there was a lot of interaction between them, a lot of dogfights, a lot of interactions. For the most part, the RAF and RCAF did really well. They'd lost about 106 aircraft, and well, you can see the number: 68 pilots and aircrew lost. 62. Sorry, I've got those numbers wrong. It's not 62 KIA. It's less than that. Whatever 68 less 17 is. 29 wounded in action. It's worth pointing out that about 10 of the aircraft lost on the Allied side were lost to reasons other than being shot down by the Luftwaffe. There was, I think, 6 aircraft that were shot down by Royal Navy and Army anti-aircraft gunners. There were 2 Spitfires that collided over the English Channel on their return to England. There was that one Typhoon that was shot down by a Spitfire. So the Luftwaffe wasn't quite as effective as 106, but they gave pretty good. For the claims made by the Allied pilots, you can see that they were very high: 96 destroyed, 39 probable, and 135 damaged. After the war, when we were able to get into the German records, we found out that as expected, those numbers were very overinflated, almost double what had actually happened. A total of 28 bombers and 20 fighters were actually shot down during the operation. For the RCAF, they'd lost 14 aircraft and 9 pilots killed. They'd claimed 10 destroyed and 2 probable and another 14 damaged. For the way that these things are calculated at the time, this was a very successful mission from the RAF's point of view. They had achieved what they wanted. They had brought the Luftwaffe up to battle. They'd given them a good fight. They knew that their claims would be a little higher than actual Luftwaffe losses, but I'm not sure they quite expected it to be double what had actually happened. But in terms of the claims and losses on both sides, from the RAF perspective, this was a very good mission. For regular missions over the continent at this point in the war, the standard circuses and rhubarbs and ranger missions, they were experiencing about, by their calculations at the time, about a 2-for-1 ratio of aircraft lost to enemy aircraft shot down. So 2 Allied aircraft lost for every Luftwaffe aircraft shot down. After the war, it was found out that the ratio was more like 4-to-1. But here, the expectation coming back was about a 1-to-1 ratio of kills on either side, which was really good for the time. And even later, when it was found to be about a 2-to-1 ratio, that's still a really good operation from their point of view. They achieved their operational goals. They protected the invasion. They protected the Navy. They got the job done. So from the RAF perspective, Dieppe was an enormous success. It was the kind of mission they wanted to do again. It was the kind of mission that they wanted to repeat. But as we know, this was a one-off mission, something that wasn't going to happen again, at least in this kind of way, shape, or form. So that's kind of an overview of Dieppe, and I'm sure there's more to discuss about that. But I want to move on and talk a little bit about the strategic bombing of Germany. This is a topic that I've given a lot of thought to, and has been sort of front and center in my mind recently with events that are taking place in Ukraine in terms of Russian excesses against Ukrainian cities, the wanton bombing, missiling of civilian targets. Artillery has a big role in that too. And the reaction of people when a missile hits a shopping mall, like it just did a couple days ago. And I haven't heard the latest casualty total, but it was something in the neighborhood of 50 the last time I heard, but I'm sure that's going to go up. And look back to what was taking place during the Second World War and the destruction, the death, the killing was orders of magnitude greater. And it raises that question: was this a legitimate target, or was it a war crime? And I think it's important that we take this in terms of the context of the times, in terms of what was going on. The Valor and the Horror is something that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with from 1992. I can't believe it's that old, but it's a program that's gotten a lot of discussion. There's been a lot of people talking about it with regards to Canadians' understanding of the Second World War. It was a CBC National Film Board production that looked at Canada's Second World War. It had 3 episodes. One looked at Hong Kong. Brad St. Croix gets into fits when he looks at sort of their portrayal of the Hong Kong operation. There was one on Bomber Command, which we'll talk about a little bit, and then there was one on Normandy, which really focused in on the destruction of the Black Watch at Verrières Ridge. And if you look at sort of what underpins the themes of those topics, it's all about Canadian failures in the Second World War. You don't have an episode on D-Day. You don't have an episode on the battle in the Scheldt or the battle in the Rhineland or any other areas where the Canadians excelled and did really well and punched above their weight. You're looking at 3 failures. And in fact, they were supposed to do a 4th episode in this series on Dieppe, which really just sort of hammers home what the McKenna brothers were trying to do. They were a pair of Montreal born and raised producers who'd grown up in that period of the 60s, the Vietnam War, the anti-war effort. And they really took their worldview, their view of war seen through the prism of the Vietnam War, and applied it to their understanding and consequently viewers' understanding of Canada's Second World War. So it was problematic for a lot of different reasons, and that doesn't even get into all the errors of fact and omission that took place. But you can see the quotation I've pulled from their description of the Death by Moonlight episode, and it's we could spend an entire hour talking about the problems with that episode. A good friend of mine, Laurie Peliquin, wrote an article years ago in Canadian Military History addressing the idea that this was a secret plan, that the public wasn't told about the bombing and the death and destruction that was being wrought. And she went and looked at the newspapers and magazines of the time, the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, Maclean's, and it was all right there in black and white. Headlines like Berlin hamburgerized, the idea that Hamburg, which had been destroyed by a firebombing mission, became the precedent that was applied to the destruction of other German cities. And there were no punches pulled in the media. It was all out in the open, the damage, the destruction. And the public was by and large behind that effort. It was a total war effort. The Germans had started the war. The Germans had bombed Warsaw and Rotterdam and London and Coventry, and here they were just getting a taste of their own medicine. And in Arthur Harris's famous turn of phrase, they reaped the whirlwind. So it's an interesting perspective. Malcolm Gladwell is somebody who's recently turned his attention to the Bomber War. He wrote a very popular, well-received in the public sphere book called The Bomber Mafia, that it is about as good a history as The Valor and the Horror, and the less said about that, the better. But I won't get into that. Happy to talk about that in later question and answers. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, Bomber Harris to some, Butcher Harris to others. He was totally and 100% behind the idea of area bombing, bombing German cities to knock Germany out of the war. And his quotation here is about as frank an admission of what he was trying to do as there was. I do not personally regard the whole of the remaining cities of Germany as worth the bones of one British grenadier. He wanted to bomb Germany back into the Stone Age. Now that's a LeMay phrase or one that's been attributed to LeMay, but he was fully supportive of the idea of area bombing to stop Germany's ability to wage war and end the war on Allied terms. So he was fully behind that. This is an issue that is one that pops up every once in a while, this idea of precision versus area bombing. And about this, I have to say that the Americans have a much better PR department than the British and the Canadians do, that they did their daylight precision bombing, whereas the British and Canadians were doing area bombing or city busting or the destruction of civilian areas. The Americans had the B-17. They had the Norden bomb sight, which was about as sophisticated a piece of technology as you could find in the Second World War. And they'd done tests in the desert at the start of the war or before the war, and they found that from 20,000 feet or from 25,000 feet using their Norden bomb sight, they could literally put the bomb in the pickle barrel. Extraordinarily accurate, very well done, so that they could not do city bombing, which was what the British did, because it was the only target they could find and hit under wartime conditions. The Americans professed to be doing precision bombing. They weren't attacking cities, they were attacking factories, they were attacking marshalling yards. They were hitting precise targets and avoiding those kind of wider mass casualty events. But it was really more of an illusion than a reality in the conditions over Germany and occupied Europe. The Americans professed to be doing precision bombing, but for the most part, they were really just doing the same city bombing that the RAF was doing, that they would profess to be targeting certain targets, but except under perfect ideal conditions, they were as accurate or even less accurate than the British, because the Americans soon found out that over the conditions in Northern Europe, that you don't have the clear windless conditions you have in the desert. You have clouds, you have high winds, you have flak, you have Luftwaffe, you have other issues that all combine to seriously degrade the accuracy of this miraculous bomb sight. And in fact, the RAF in many cases was more accurate because they were using a radar sight, H2S or H2X, that allowed them an approximate ability to be accurate in the conditions they found over Northern Europe, in darkness, in cloud, in fog, in smoke, and so forth. So on average, the British and Canadians were more accurate than the Americans, whereas the Americans could have impressive feats of individual accuracy. Overall, their general accuracy average was much lower. So don't buy into that American PR. Canadianization is an interesting topic, and one that Arthur Harris was dead set against. He thought it was going to destroy the effectiveness of his RAF Bomber Command formations. The idea behind Canadianization was that we would have a all-Canadian bomber group. We would have the number 6 group, which was all Canadian squadrons, mostly Canadian personnel, though there was certainly lots of British and Australian and New Zealand aircrew that were mixed in there as well. But Harris didn't like the loss of control. This all harkens back to the way the government ran things in the First World War. We had Arthur Currie's Canadian Corps that was a recognizable Canadian contribution to the war effort. On the ground side, there's the Canadian divisions, the Canadian Corps 1 and 2, and 1st Canadian Army. But for the Air Force, there was really no recognizable Canadian formation level, sort of large formation. There were lots of squadrons, there were wings, but there wasn't a group. There certainly wasn't a Canadian Air Force. So the decision was made to band all the RCAF bomber squadrons together as 6 group. And Harris thought this was going to take control away. Of course, Canadians began to have Canadian command authority, although it was not really exercised in the RCAF in the way that Arthur Currie could play the national card, or Harry Crerar could say, I don't want to do this for Canadian reasons, and get away with talking to Montgomery like that. 6 group couldn't do that. And Harris was initially proven right. When 6 group was formed, it performed very poorly. It had very low accuracy rates. It had high loss rates. They were flying the Halifax at that point, which was proving to be not quite as effective a bomber as the Lancaster was. But it turns out that when you look at the sort of the buildup of all the British bomber command groups, that sixth group just went through the normal teething learning process of the way a group improves, trains, learns, and becomes an effective organization. So that by 1945, much sooner than that, but certainly by 1945, sixth group was arguably one of the better groups in RAF Bomber Command in terms of loss rates, in terms of bombing accuracy, in terms of aircraft returning without bombing, all the measurable statistics. So Harris was proven wrong. Sixth Group measurably improved the ability of his command to get its job done. This is kind of taking a bit of a business analysis to the bombing campaign, costs versus accomplishments. We can talk about opportunity cost. It was a vast contribution to build these bomber fleets, to skim off the cream of the crop in terms of manpower resources for pilots and bombardiers and air crew, to build the aircraft, to build the airfields. And I don't know the exact numbers, but I think it's something like 40% of Allied input into the war, economic input into the war, supported aircraft and bombers in particular. So there were huge costs. And what were the accomplishments? Well, depends who you talk to. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey after the war was very pessimistic, thinking that it didn't end the war any sooner than if there'd been no bombing. They point to things like the fact that German production continued to increase right through till the end of the war in some sectors and stuff like that. But in many ways, that doesn't take into account what German industry would have done if there had been no bombing. Sure, they're increasing. Sure, they're becoming more effective. But are they building quality products? Are they building bombs that are going to explode or bombs that are going to be duds? How many more aircraft could they have built if they didn't have to have satellite factories all over the place and build things in cave and truck them together for final assembly and so forth? So yes, German production went up, but how high could it have gone? Things like that. Morale is another interesting point to look at. During the First World War, when cities were first bombed, there was an appreciable almost panic in British cities when the Zeppelins and later Gotha bombers first came over. And there was the fear that if you sort of ramp that up 10 times, that you could break the morale of the civilian population and knock them out of the war. But I think as the Battle of Britain and especially the Blitz showed, civilians dug in. There was that resolution, that calm, the famous British stiff upper lip. What is it? Keep calm and be calm. I forget the exact turn of phrase, but the morale never broke. It maybe buckled, it maybe dipped, but it never broke. And I'm not sure why they expected German morale to break when British morale wouldn't. But it certainly had an impact in letting the Germans know that they had lost the war in the way that the First World War ended with the Germans marching off the battlefield. And the idea of Germany hadn't been defeated in the field, but had lost because of the politicians, the stab in the back. At the end of the Second World War, there was absolutely no doubt that Germany had lost. And the destruction of their cities from the air was a really big part of that. Talked about the forced diversion of the economy, Axis response. But we talk about the bombing campaign siphoning off German resources. I think anywhere between 1 and 2 million Germans were involved in defense of the Reich, whether that be in anti-aircraft units or disaster response, fire services, medical services, cleaning up after the bomber raids. It was a huge input of German resources to do that. And also, where could all those resources have gone otherwise? All those Luftwaffe squadrons that were defending against the bomber screens, all those 88 millimeter guns that were a very effective anti-aircraft gun, but were an even more effective anti-tank gun. What if you take another 500 or 1,000 88s and take them to Normandy in the summer of 1944? What does that do? So there's something like that. Mining and U-boats, Bomber Command certainly had a big input in supporting that. And as I alluded to earlier, there was widespread Allied public support for the bombing campaign. There were certainly aspects that condemned it. The Bishop of Chichester was a notable voice that was talking about how terrible this was. But by and large, the Allied civilians considered bombing a necessary evil, something that had to be done, and probably something the Germans deserved, and were fully supportive of that taking place. By the end of the war, Sixth Group alone had flown some 41,000 sorties and dropped 126,000 tons of bombs. And that was effective. It did a lot to further the goals of Bomber Command and the strategic bombing campaign in general. But it came at a very high cost. 814 aircraft were lost. Just think of that, 814 aircraft. 3,500 aircraft were, 3,500 aircrew were lost in action. And in total, some 10,600 Canadians died while serving with Bomber Command. And you're wondering, okay, how does that equate? 3,500 died with Sixth Group. Well, there was a lot of RCAF personnel that served outside of RCAF squadrons. So they were flying with British squadrons or Norwegian squadrons or New Zealand squadrons, exact stuff like that. And also additional, even more, were killed in accidents and training. We can never forget the civilian cost. There was some 600,000 German civilians that were killed during the course of the bombing. And also, as is becoming more apparent as scholars dig into it, the bombing had a big effect on our allies, on the civilian populations in France and Italy and other places like that, where they got wound up into it. Stephen Burke has just published a really great book called Beyond the Beachhead, where he looks at the impact of bombers on French civilians, on French cities during the invasion period. I want to sort of zero in on that for a second and talk about a particular RAF, RCAF operation that took place in late 1944, and that was the bombing of the dikes on Walcheren Island and at West Capelle in particular. And we could talk for a long time about the Canadians' role in the Scheldt campaign, which to my mind, I said this yesterday, is perhaps the most important Canadian Army campaign of the Second World War. General Simmons was looking for innovative ways to get the job done in a situation where he didn't have all the resources that he needed or wanted. And the island of Walcheren, or virtual island of Walcheren as it was at the time, was a big German bastion that was going to cause a lot of problems. It was very well armed, probably heavier defended than any of the D-Day beaches the Allies had to assault. So he needed to find a way to neutralize it. And he came up with the idea of sinking the island, of breaching the dikes and allowing the North Sea to flood in and cover the ground, because the industrious Dutch had recovered most of that island from the sea, and the vast majority of the island lays below sea level and was protected from the turbulent waters only by the dikes. So they came up with a plan to bomb the dike in 3 places, breach it and allow it to be flooded. And West Capelle was one of those spots. The slide up on your screen now shows one of those breaches at West Capelle. The air photograph shows clearly where the breach was made and the village of West Capelle being inundated. The photo on the right shows West Capelle after the war, and you can clearly see that even though the water has receded, the damage that remains. In the top right corner, you can see the lighthouse that still stands today, and it's also visible here. There's a noticeable shadow, which is where the lighthouse was, and I'll ask you to recall that, because I was in West Capelle in 2019. It was actually my last trip before the world shut down. And I spent a night in West Capelle and went wandering about after dinner, and I walked up to the lighthouse because I wanted to see it. And I'm sure this isn't a secret to everybody, but it was a major discovery for me. I went around behind the lighthouse, and there's I'm not quite sure if it's a cemetery or a memorial, but there's a memorial to all the citizens of West Capelle that were killed during the Allied bombing raids. And that field has a series of plaques, and each plaque has 1 or 2 names on it of people that were killed during the Allied bombing. And there's a close-up of them. I don't know how good your Dutch is, but you can see the person's name and then their age. 31 years old, 4 years old, Van Peen, 10 years old, and his younger, I don't know, brother or sister who was 1 year old. And the death and the destruction are almost unfathomable for that small village. I just got a small account I want to read to you because I think it really brings home how terrible that was for that small village. The bombardment lasts more than 2 hours, new waves of attacks every 15 minutes. The first bomb hits not only the dike, but also a large part of the village. Some people in the basement are killed instantly. After just 1 hour, the floodwaters come through the dike opening and flow through the village, drowning many people. Only 3 of 47 people, 2 adults and a baby, who are sheltered in the basement of the mill are rescued from the rubble. Another 113 people die in West Capelle, for a total of 157 villagers killed in the bombing. So the bombing of West Capelle, the sinking of Walcheren Island, was a success from the Allied point of view. It was one that was more or less supported by the Dutch as a necessary act in winning the bigger war, but it had a huge impact on that local population that will never be forgotten. There's also a huge effect on the air crew during the war. This is a photograph in a cemetery that I took that I always find poignant, because when you find headstones together like that, it almost always represents the crew of a bomber that has crashed. And in the course of pulling the bodies out of the wreckage, it's often unclear who is who. And so they're buried in a common grave. And they know that those 5 men were all in the bomber, but they're not able to give them an individual burial. So they're buried as a crew together with the headstones touching or virtually touching. And I always find that very poignant in life as in death. But for the RCAF, during the course of the war, they lost 13,000 men killed on operations or who died in prisoner of war camps, and a further 4,000 were killed in training operations. An absolutely enormous loss, very big. You can see that I'd mentioned earlier about 10,000 were killed on bomber command operations. So that was the biggest component of Air Force deaths during the Second World War. And I guess just to sort of bring it full circle, King was a visionary. He saw the importance of the BCATP and in supporting the Allied war effort and accomplishing what the Allies needed to do to prepare for the air war, to train the pilots, to train the air crew, and everything like that. But it's very clear that this wasn't some kind of a cheap support for the war. There was a cost in dollars and also a cost in Canadian blood to make that happen. So I think I'll draw that to an end there. I'm happy to take any questions you might have and keep this going for as long as you have the stamina for. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Mike. I think I liked kind of the 3-pronged approach to your talk. I think it really gave us a really good sense of the RCAF's role in the war. We got a ton of questions coming in, which is terrific. It's always easier on my end when I don't have to come up with questions on the fly. But before I do, Mike, would you mind stop sharing your screen?
Yes.
All right. Okay, well, why don't we just move through each of those 3 prongs, starting from the beginning then. The first question coming from Brett Paveling in Mississauga, going back to this idea that you brought up about the BCATP and kind of geographic location choice. He's curious, Mike, if these locations were chosen at all based on kind of the topographical or geographical similarities to the areas where the pilots might be deployed in Europe, or was it entirely based upon, as you mentioned, just basically, open space and the accessibility to either building or already built airways?
Yeah, that's a good question, and thank you very much for that. It really had nothing to do, well, I won't say nothing. It had much less to do with where the pilots and aircrew would be fighting then sort of utilizing what was available in Canada. And one thing I didn't really discuss was the sort of the legacy of the BCATP. And there was a huge bump in Canadian air-mindedness because of that program. So some of the stations that were built were based on existing airfields or establishments, but there was a vast construction program that either built new runways, new airfields, new training bases out of nothing, or vastly expanded existing facilities to meet the needs. And they just went where they needed to go. But Jonathan Vance has written quite extensively about this Canadian air-mindedness and an attempt in the 1930s, 20s, but mostly in the 30s to create Canada as an air nation and build airfields across the country so a plane could fly from coast to coast. And it had a good start before the war started, but it was vastly increased after the construction of these BCATP bases. These bases had a resonance in the post-war world. Many of them still exist today. If you've seen that sort of typical triangular pattern of airfield, you can see it on Google Maps, and in a lot of locations, that's almost certainly a BCATP field. But not just the infrastructure that was built, the expansion of airfields that were allowed to be used for civilian purposes after the war, but also the Canadians that were trained in working in airfields, in being mechanics to repair aircraft, and being air traffic controllers or administrators to run the airfields. And it all had a really big residual effect on increasing that air-mindedness, increasing that ability of Canada to sort of enter the air age and take advantage of the aircraft in a way that wouldn't have been possible without that program.
Continuing along on the BCATP, we have someone tuning in terrific from New Zealand. Reg Newell has a question because he's been doing some research on the Royal New Zealand Air Force, and for him was astonishing, as you mentioned as well at the beginning, Mike, of how quickly things were built up. To go from virtually nothing to, in the case of the Royal New Zealanders, 20 squadrons. But Reg's question is how the BCATP was able to get kind of a cohort of skilled trainers in such a short period of time to train all of these future pilots and aircrew.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and welcome all the way from the other side of the world. I don't know what time it is there. Is it like first thing in the morning there? But the BCATP kind of ate its own young. It's maybe not the right analogy, but they would usually skim off the best and the brightest graduates from the program. So the pilots that graduated at the top of their class, or the bombardiers, would often be held back and converted to trainers to train the next class. And it was a tough assignment. Being a pilot trainer, an instructor, is a tough gig. It's a dangerous gig. It's a unforgiving gig, but it's also not where these young guys wanted to be. They wanted to be pilots. They wanted to be getting at the Germans or the Italians or the Japanese, not stuck in Canada doing the training. But it was essential that they do that role, because that's the only way you can propagate the numbers, increase the size, is by having more trained personnel to train the next group, the next cohort, the next class.
I'm gonna, for the next question, Mike, I want to do one more on the BCATP, and then we can move on to Dieppe and Bomber Command. I'm going to alter Alex Fitzgerald Black's question just a little bit, because you did mention that you thought there was kind of a lack of scholarship in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. And so Alex's question, of course, he's the director of the Juno Beach Center, and I believe he's tuning in from Guelph tonight. So his question is, would you say that the scholarship, academic scholarship, tends to overlook the role of the RCAF during the Second World War? But I'm going to add a second point to that, and that is kind of what sort of scholarship has been done on the BCATP, and what in particular do you think might be picked up on a little bit more and pushed forward?
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Alex. I'll add a caveat. I don't think there's a lack of scholarship on the topic. I think there's room for more, which I think is a really important distinction. What's out there is really good. Rachel Lee Heidi's been writing some fantastic stuff that's very academic. It's not getting the sort of popular audience that I think it deserves, but there's a whole range of more popular histories of the BCATP that are out there, and you know them as well as I do. But I think what's missing are some more pointed technical studies on how the program worked, how the training worked. There's some great individual books, but they're more anecdotal. And I think it would benefit from an academic eye. I think there's also, and our friend from New Zealand is a great example of this. I think there's, as is so often the case in Canadian history, a tendency to stovepipe our view of the BCATP, and we're looking at it as if it's the only place in the world where aircrew are being trained, and that's not the case. There was training, I think there's training in New Zealand, certainly in Australia, in South Africa, in Texas, and in the UK for sure. And how do all these fit together? Were there synergies? Were there overlaps? Were there experiences that were built on, transmitted, shared, ignored, lost? Was there stovepiping at the time, and that what was taking place in Canada wasn't having any kind of impact on what was happening in Australia? So I think that's a room, and I mean that's the kind of thing we see a lot of academic studies doing now, sort of bringing together these various stovepipes and creating a bit more of an omnibus understanding of what's going on. And I think the BCATP, more than a lot of topics, would really benefit from that. But yeah, I mean, there's great stuff that's out there that's been written, but like anything, there's still more stories to be told. There's more analysis. There's more that can further our understanding. I don't think enough has been done on, and maybe I'm totally wrong on this, I haven't seen it, on that sort of residual effect of the BCATP. I'd love to see a social study of the impact that it had on Canada after the war. What was done with the facilities? Where did the personnel go? What impact did those trained air traffic controllers and mechanics and administrators have on the development of Canadian aviation? And sort of in the same way that the sort of the ending of the Avro Aero program sent Canadian engineers to work for NASA. Well, what impact did the end of the war and then the shutting down of the plan have on the Canadian aviation sector?
Yeah, and it just came to my mind too. I wonder what, and maybe there has been some scholarship, and Mike, you can speak to us to it as if there has been, but the connection between, you know, the end of the war and those who were in the BCATP, and then the beginning of the Avro Aero program, and if there's any connections between those two, whether it's, you know, air crew, air engineers, or whatever moving to that project, maybe an interesting question to ask.
Yeah, funny you mentioned that. I've just been reading A Bridge of Ships by James Pritchard, which is a really excellent study of the development of the Canadian shipbuilding industry in Canada during the Second World War. And it's really got me thinking about why do we not have a similar book on the Canadian aviation sector? Because there was really important development of industry building aircraft during the Second World War, from the Hurricanes and Helldivers being built in was it Sault Ste. Marie, to Avro at Malton and other facilities. Why hasn't somebody taken on that topic? And I would love to see a detailed study of the development of Canadian aviation industry during the Second World War, and also how that applied into the post-war world and everything like that. So yeah, really lots that can still be done.
Yeah, and it kind of picks up on, you know, some of the scholarship of, you know, Alex Suchin, War Junk. He's spoken at our speaker series as well, and how war material get transformed into kind of peacetime goods and peacetime services. But let's move on to the Dieppe raid. I don't have too many questions about the Dieppe part, Mike, but one of them comes from Philip Osanek, longtime viewer. Phil, I'm glad you're tuning in tonight. It's good to see you. Talking about the kind of difference between claimed kills and then also what actually transpired in terms of the numbers killed. Is that a result of pilots over-reporting? Or overemphasizing or exaggerating what they were able to accomplish, or is it a PR aspect? This is some of the things that Phil is wondering.
Yeah, all of the above. It's an issue that goes back to the First World War, and there's been, I don't even want to guess at how much ink has been spilled over the issue of kills and claims and everything like that. I can reach on my shelf and have books about kills from the First World War, and I've got an entire shelf of the same kind of thing for the Second World War, and it's problematic, and some of it has to do with the bravado of the pilots. It takes a certain type of person to be a fighter pilot, and you have to be very sure of yourself and very confident and everything like that. But it's also the nature of the beast in terms of what the environment was like. It's fast, it's busy, it's dangerous. You don't have the luxury of sort of following an enemy aircraft and firing on it and then watching it until it crashes. You're kind of getting snippets as you're flying it, 100 miles an hour in the First World War or 300 miles an hour in the Second World War. And you might just take a few blasts at something and think you've got it. You might see smoke, you might see it sort of wing over and dive to the ground. You might see it go into a spin, but some pilots talk about sort of doing that intentionally to throw off their attacker and faking being a kill. And then once the enemy is left, they just level off and go on their merry way. So that's a kill that's been claimed by that pilot when he gets back to his airfield that day. I'm sure there was some overclaiming, but I think most of it was really honest reporting of what they thought they did. It just turns out that they weren't quite as effective. There's a great story that I love from the Normandy campaign where the operational research teams were trying to figure out how much German material had been destroyed by the air forces during the Battle of the Falaise Gap. And they found the hulk of a German tank that was very prominently on the side of a hill. And they talked to a local French farmer, and he said, yeah, that tank's been attacked dozens of times. It seems like anytime an aircraft goes over, it sees the tank and goes down and fires it, whether it be shooting rockets or dropping bombs or firing cannons. And you just know that one tank that was maybe destroyed the first time by an aircraft has been claimed tens, dozens, hundreds of times by other pilots who are absolutely convinced that they knocked out that tank. And so I don't think you can blame or criticize pilots for their claims. You just have to cast a wary eye and say, chances are that's a little inflated over what actually happened.
Sorry, I just lost my question here, Mike. Just a quick question here from Jim Walker in Toronto. I was just curious about the size of a typical squadron. How many aircraft would be composed, or how many, what would be composed in a squadron in terms of aircraft?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's one that changes and is different for different times in the war or different types of aircraft. 12 aircraft is generally the establishment of a squadron, but depending on the point in the war, it might be less, it might be more. You would generally have anywhere from 12 to 16 pilots, sometimes as many as 24 pilots in a squadron that would cycle through those aircraft. But it was, trying to know that is like hitting a moving target, but 12 is a pretty good average number for the number of aircraft in a squadron.
Probably turn my microphone on. Next question from Dave Alexander. He always asks fantastic questions from Owen Sound whenever he comes to these webinars. So thanks, Dave. His question to you, Mike, is why were so many young Canadians, both men and women, drawn to the RCAF?
Thanks for that question, Dave. That's a great one. Pilots were sexy. Pilots were, it was the thing that everybody wanted to be. It was the new technology. It was the barnstormers and the bush pilots and the great aces of the First World War. It was the adventurers. It was where the best and the brightest were going. It was the uniforms, the RAF, RCAF blue was coveted. It was the kind of uniform that got the girls, and so there was a lot behind that. It was also, and I'm not sure this is the main reason, it was thought of a way of avoiding the trenches, of avoiding the death and the destruction on the battlefield in a way that was more scientific, more clinical, maybe safer. So that, yeah, there was a whole bunch of reasons that drew young men to the Air Force and drew their admirers as well.
Following up on that, a question from Reinhold Schmidt. It's been uncovered, particularly by Jonathan Vance, in the context of the First World War, that there were a startling number of Americans that actually served in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Picking up on that question, Reinhold wonders if there were any Americans that entered the Canadian training program prior to the States entering the war.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question. It's a good one. I don't have the exact numbers, but there was certainly a large number of Americans that came north to join the RCAF before the Americans joined the war in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor in December 41. But even still, there was a lot that stayed in the RCAF, the RAF during the course of the war. Some of them were given the opportunity to transfer to the U.S. Army Air Forces, and some certainly did. But there was a lot that joined the Canadian Air Force and stayed and made a good career of it. What's his name? The author of High Flight, McGee, that famous poem, was an American serving in the RCAF.
I've got a question here from Wayne, but I think I want to acknowledge first that, it's, I find that when I put together the Maple Leaf Route webinar series this year, I got worried a little bit when I asked for these kind of broad overview lectures, because I know it's a lot to be able to contain. And so, when these speakers put their talks together, they're not able to talk about every single thing that you could think of in the context of the air war during the Second World War, for example. But Wayne's question is in regards to Coastal Command, as he was really hoping to hear more about it. And since you didn't get a chance to touch on it, he was hoping that you might perhaps talk about the role of Coastal Command.
Yeah. Sorry about that. There's so much. We'd be here till after midnight if we did a sort of a more comprehensive survey of what the RCAF was doing during the war. But Coastal Command was absolutely essential. I'd urge you to go find Jeff Hayes has written a really fantastic article about his uncle, who was a pilot in, I think it was 120 Squadron. That was flying out of Iceland, and they were flying the VLR Liberator, the very long-range Liberator, out over the North Atlantic. And those Coastal Command squadrons were absolutely essential at closing the mid-ocean gap, that area where the U-boats had been able to play and act without any kind of oversight. Because from early on in the war, the RAF from the UK and Scotland and Iceland, and the RCAF from Nova Scotia and Newfoundland had been able to protect convoys that were close to the coast, but there was that section, the black gap in the middle of the Atlantic, where aircraft just couldn't reach. And Canadians flying VLR Liberators were key in closing that gap and making sure that convoys going from Nova Scotia to Liverpool or New York to Liverpool had air cover the entire way. And that was a huge role, huge importance in protecting the convoys and making sure that lifeline remained open and wasn't interdicted by German U-boats. So yeah, and I mean, that's just one aspect. There were many Coastal Command squadrons that were doing things like interdicting coastal traffic, flying the Bristol Beaufighter that could fire 8 rockets and was very effective at knocking out German convoys that were trying to hug the coast and things like that. So yeah, Coastal Command is often the sort of the forgotten stepsister in the story. And I'm sorry, I kind of overlooked it as well, but it's a really important story that maybe we can talk about in a future lecture.
We got about 6 minutes left here, Mike. So maybe I'll ask two more questions, and then if we got a little bit more time, I'll sneak in a third. But I think we'll aim for just two more questions, and then we'll wrap things up. Question coming from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, my hometown, from Russell Eisinger. So his question is about the post-war RCAF, Mike, and he mentioned that. Yeah, exactly. And so he says that the post-war RCAF was largely a fighter force. What happened to the bomber generals, and why did they not have apparent influence in the shape of the post-war RCAF?
Oh, Russell, that's a really good question, and one I would love to know a little bit more about. There were a lot of connections between the RCAF, the Second World War, and the RCAF, the Cold War. You just have to look at the chiefs of the air staff and guys like Leckie and others who sort of came up through the ranks and had significant careers as not necessarily operational commanders, but as commanders in the RCAF, and then continued to rise and ended up in sort of the highest ranks in the Cold War Air Force. I'm not sure that kind of a career could be planned. I mean, at the end of the Second World War, the RCAF was slashed. The war was over. Mackenzie King wasn't willing to sort of keep a force in being, so the RCAF got rid of its aircraft, got rid of its personnel, and there was just a small rump state. And it was only the sort of the start of the Cold War and the threat posed by the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact that saw the RCAF scale up again to unprecedented levels in terms of squadrons deployed in Canada, and especially deployed in France and Germany and places like that. There's a really good collection of essays on Canadian chiefs of the air staff that is coming out sometime hopefully in the next year, published by the Royal Canadian Air Force's History and Heritage section. That's really going to fill in some of those gaps on who these men were at the sort of most senior level. But there's so much work that needs to be done on the Cold War Air Force. Bert Franson, who I know is here, has written some great stuff. There's some other stuff, but there's like Randy Wakelam has written Cold War Fighters. Randy's here as well. There's so much that's been written, but there's so much more that we don't know and needs to be studied and increase our knowledge of that period.
So why don't I end with one final question here, Mike? And actually, before I do, I just want to mention to the folks that didn't get a chance to have their question asked. There's so many good questions in here. It was hard to choose from them, but there's still 20 left on the board, and I'm sorry that we couldn't go any longer. But I don't want to keep Mike here for too long, and I don't want you all to be kept too long either. So if you do have a question that you just have a burning desire to have answered, Mike has included his email, which some of you might have noted down during his presentation. But if you would like to send the questions to me, I'm more than happy to forward them along to Mike, and he can respond to them in good time. But Mike, I want to ask the last question to you, because you made mention of when you pivoted to the third and final section on Bomber Command. You made reference to kind of what's going on now in Ukraine, and the Russian bombings of various Ukrainian cities. I wonder if there's kind of a few things that you might kind of advise the audience to keep in mind when thinking about the history of, bombing cities during the Second World War. What are some things that perhaps the audience might keep in mind as they watch these kind of horrendous events unfold in Ukraine?
Yeah, I'll answer that in 2 points. First, and I didn't do a great job of summing it up, but I highly recommend you read a book called How the War Was Won by Phillips O'Brien, that looks at the war from a perspective of sort of a macro level of who contributed to the victory. And there's this idea out there that the Soviets won the Second World War, that they defeated 3/4 of the German army on the Eastern Front and had a much bigger role to play in defeating Hitler's Germany than the Western Allies did. Phillips O'Brien does a fantastic job of charting the industrial output of the German state. And he shows very conclusively that the vast majority of the industrial power, the economic power of Germany was devoted to fighting the Western allies in terms of building U-boats, in terms of building the Luftwaffe, in terms of defending against the bomber campaign and other issues like that. And manpower is one issue, but it's maybe not the most important issue. That it was the Western allies' mastery of the sea and mastery of the air that really attritted the German state in a way that had a bigger role to play in bringing the war to a conclusion than perhaps the destruction of the German Wehrmacht did on the Eastern Front. So that's an important point in terms of looking at the efficacy of the bomber campaign, of the strategic bombing campaign. It was very important in ending the war. And we can't forget what a monstrous tyranny Nazi Germany was with their treatment of Jews and Roma and other persons. It was a regime that had to be ended any way that it could. To bring that forward to the present time, our calculations on how wars are fought are very different now. Whereas before it was okay to, well, I won't say okay, where it was accepted practice to bomb a city and civilians were, if not legitimate targets, valid collateral damage. I'm sounding really obtuse here, but that's a fair assessment of it. Today, that's changed. We can look at the Canadians in Afghanistan and talk about the strategic corporal, where one wrong interview, one wrong word by a corporal that gets out into the media can have strategic effects on what's going on, whereas a corporal in Normandy couldn't possibly affect anything other than what he can see out of his foxhole. And the same way, you couldn't consider bombing a city into submission, especially from a Western perspective, because the outrage, the media attention wouldn't be sustainable. Dropping one 500-pound bomb in the wrong place today can have a huge worldwide impact in the way that wasn't possible 75 years ago. So in the Ukraine, well, we're seeing a war that I'd never thought we would see in my lifetime, sort of a full spectrum, high intensity industrial war of a nature that we haven't seen, especially in Europe, but rarely around the world in the recent past. And it's very clear that the Russians are playing by a different rule book than the rest of the world. They are doing things that are unthinkable by the West. They're getting roundly condemned for it. They're paying a price in loss of economic and political capital, but they are continuing to do it. So the way wars are fought today are very different. They're much more precise. Yes, it's all-out war in Ukraine, but it's very different in scale and even casualties. Casualties are terrible, but they don't compare to sort of what was happening in the Second World War. But that doesn't make them any less devastating, any less terrible. The difference is that the German family that was killed in a bombing in Dresden isn't on CNN within hours or hasn't been live streamed and is telling their story, whereas in the Ukraine, we're seeing the bombs hit, we're seeing the impact, we're seeing the bodies being brought out, and it's a very different war. And I think the Russians have severely miscalculated the way that this would be viewed. I think they thought there would be an apathy and a disinterest from the wider world community, that there would be outrage, but it would pass quickly, just like when they took over the Crimea. But I think they've badly miscalculated, and I think that the West is more or less firmly behind Ukraine, and that we're digging in. Today, the Canadian government just announced that we are sort of doubling down with our battle group in Latvia, and we're seeing Canadian militarism isn't the right word, but support of the military and willingness to resort to martial means in a way that we haven't seen in a very long time. I mean, supplying M777s to support the Ukrainians, ammunition, things like that. It's a different kind of war, and it's interesting to watch as it unfolds.
I think it's a great place to end things, Mike. I just want to say, first of all, thanks so much for generously donating your time for us tonight. It was a pleasure. And even though I had kind of the scaries going into this series about some of these overview lectures, I have not been disappointed in any of the first three. So Mike, I just want to say thanks a lot for keeping our track record strong and good. And we'll definitely hope to have you back at some point soon, hopefully not over camera, but in person.
Yeah, hopefully in person. That would be great to actually see some smiling faces in the audience in front. So yeah, thanks very much, Eric, for having me here. I've had a great time talking about the Air Force. And if anybody does want to get in touch, it's mike@blackflight.ca. Happy to take your emails, or find me on Twitter. It's Mike_Bechtold. I'm on Twitter all the time, and happy to talk about the Air Force or just about anything else you want to discuss. So thanks again, everybody. And thanks for your patience. There was a great audience here tonight.
A terrific audience indeed. Looking ahead, the fourth event in the Maple Leaf Route webinar series, I can't believe we're already on the second half of this second season, will take place on the 20th of July at our usual time slot at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Once a research associate of the Laurier Center for Military Strategic and Disarmament Studies came before the Laurier Center for the Study of Canada, and also completed his PhD here, Scott Sheffield at the University of the Fraser Valley will discuss First Nations people's experiences during the Second World War, which I personally am very excited and interested to hear about, as this is sort of the research that I've been doing, but in the context of the First World War. If you're interested in attending Dr. Sheffield's lecture, you can register it by going to our website, studyofcanada.ca/Maple Leaf Route. You'll be directed to it as soon as you end this webinar, so you can register immediately afterwards. If you enjoyed tonight's webinar and would like to know more about not only future webinars like Dr. Sheffield's, but other things going on at the Laurier Center for the Study of Canada, including podcasts, blogs, our journal, Canadian Military History, which Mike made mention of, the colloquium, and other things that are happening, again, you can go to our website, studyofcanada.ca, and scroll to the bottom of the page and enter in your contact information, your name and email. And from there, you will receive periodic emails from us about things that are going on and things you might be interested in viewing, reading, or attending. And I would like to say just actually one more quick thing, and then I'll let everybody go. I know we're already 7 minutes past 9 o'clock, but as Mike mentioned, and as I did too, how much we're looking forward to the time when we can go back in person. Given that nothing changes in terms of the pandemic and in terms of public health restrictions, we are fully expecting a return to in-person speaker series events in September. You can keep your eye on your emails. We'll be sending those messages out when the time comes, but you can expect once the fall arrives that we will be back again in person, but with the added caveat that for those who are not able to attend in person, we will be broadcasting live. So we will continue to engage the virtual audience as we have been doing for the past 2 years. Thanks to you all, as always, for attending tonight's webinar. We hope to see you again in 3 weeks for Dr. Sheffield's lecture, Have an excellent rest of your night, and we'll see you again very soon. Take care.